The public is being sold a narrative of hypersonic threats and impenetrable shields. The focus is always the kinetic launch, the interception. This is a deliberate, systemic misdirection. While nations like Turkey test new missile defense systems like the Cyper-1, the primary vector of attack has already shifted. The real weapon is not the warhead. It is the silence that precedes it. The mathematical certainty is this: a shielded state incentivizes its adversaries to bypass the shield entirely. The logical counter is not a symmetrical missile launch. It is asymmetric economic warfare. The target is not the city, but the data center. The vector is not the sky, but the seabed. Analysts at RUSI and CSCs have warned for years that the unprotected underbelly of the entire global order rests on a few dozen undersea fiber optic cables. Severing these arteries of information, or blinding satellite constellations, is the 21st century equivalent of a strategic blockade. It costs exponentially less than penetrating a defense shield and creates the ultimate liability, the blind Leviathan. A nation-state with unparalleled military power, but zero visibility. A financial and military giant, deaf and blind, unable to process transactions, track assets, or execute a launch-on-warning protocol. This is the new blueprint for warfare, as outlined in reports from publications like War on the Rocks. It is not about destroying assets. It is about inducing a total solvency crisis by weaponizing silence. The motive for this escalation is not strength. It is a solvency crisis. A state does not initiate a high-risk, asymmetric conflict when it is powerful. It does so when it is cornered. CSIS analysis confirms the kinetic phase of the Ukraine war quickly became a domestic liability for Russia, an unpopular drain on a fragile economic system. The war is not a projection of power. It is an act of fiscal desperation. When the cost of conventional, symmetric warfare exceeds a nation's financial and political liquidity, the war itself becomes a vector for state collapse. The state must pivot. It is a mathematical certainty. It cannot afford to compete plane for plane, tank for tank, especially against a technologically superior adversary backed by a global economic bloc. This is not a retreat. It is a calculated shift in strategy. This weakness forces the pivot to asymmetry. The objective changes from defeating an army to collapsing the system that supports it. Sabotage of critical infrastructure, cyber warfare targeting financial markets, weaponized disinformation. These are not acts of random terror. They are high-leverage, low-cost attacks designed to bypass the shield and inflict disproportionate economic pain. The proliferation of systems like Turkey's new Cyper-1 missile shield only accelerates this calculus. Each new shield removes another conventional option from an adversary's playbook, making the economic cost of a symmetric response impossible. This insolvency in kinetic options forces the hand. As War on the Rocks notes, new warfare requires more than new tech. It requires a solvent strategy. When you cannot afford the symmetric fight, asymmetry is all that is left. The entire economic model of conventional warfare is facing a solvency crisis. The math is irrefutable. According to analysts at the Royal United Services Institute, or RUSI, the kinetic cost to neutralize a $5 million main battle tank is now as low as $500, the price of a disposable first-person view drone. This is not a balanced trade. It is an economic liquidation of a legacy asset. This extreme cost asymmetry is the engine of what strategists call the democratization of violence. The monopoly on projecting significant, lethal force, once held exclusively by nation-states with trillion-dollar budgets, has collapsed. The barrier to entry is no longer industrial might. It is a credit card and an internet connection. For an adversary cornered by a missile shield, This isn't a choice. It's a mathematical imperative. Why invest billions in a symmetric response that will be intercepted when you can achieve strategic paralysis by bleeding your opponent's most expensive assets with your cheapest? Every drone in the air turns a multi-million-dollar piece of hardware into a liability. It is the perfect vector for asymmetric economic warfare, delivered kinetically. The core strategic trap is not yet being set in primary territories. It is being beta tested in the periphery. These are the gray zones. According to analysis from RUSI, these are not failed states. They are proxy laboratories. They provide a controlled environment to measure the exact kinetic cost of aggression when one actor possesses a missile defense shield. The recent activation of Turkey's Cypher-1 system is a prime example. It is the injection of a new variable into a live experiment. The shield creates a mathematical certainty. It incentivizes the shielded state to engage in conventional pressure, knowing a symmetrical response is unviable. This forces the unshielded adversary toward asymmetric escalation. What legacy media reports as disparate regional instability is merely the data readout. These are not the cause, they are the symptoms. Even the original architects of missile defense, as documented by the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, understood this paradox. The defensive weapon becomes a primary accelerant for conflict. The new way of warfare, as noted by War on the Rocks, is not about the technology itself, but the strategic imbalances it creates. These gray zones are where the true cost of that imbalance is being calibrated before deployment at scale. The launch-on-warning doctrine is not a policy of choice. It is a mathematical protocol dictated by time and physics. Analysts at CSIS define it as the protocol to launch retaliatory nuclear forces upon detecting an inbound enemy missile launch, before those enemy warheads detonate. The flight time of an ICBM is approximately 30 minutes. The decision window for a national command authority is therefore less than that. It is a zero-sum calculation to avoid a decapitation strike. This entire system has a single point of failure: data integrity. The fog of digital war is a term used by RUSI analysts to describe a scenario where a non-kinetic cyber attack blinds a nation's early warning satellite and radar network. No explosion, no missile. The enemy simply unplugs your eyes. The screens go black. The data flow ceases. The protocol, however, remains active. This creates the commander's dilemma, which is a systemic trap. With the sensor grid blinded, the commander is forced to choose between two catastrophic liabilities. Option 1. Assume it's a false alarm and do nothing, risking the complete obliteration of your retaliatory capacity if the attack is real. A national solvency crisis. Option 2. Follow the protocol's logic and launch based on the absence of information, assuming the worst. The fear of being disarmed becomes the primary accelerant for the launch. The cyber attack does not need to fake an inbound missile. It only needs to create a void. In that void, the launch-on-warning protocol defaults to a single, logical conclusion to prevent a checkmate scenario. The kinetic cost of inaction is perceived as higher than the cost of a potentially mistaken retaliation. The weapon is launched not out of aggression, but out of fear of digital blindness. This is not a system failure. It is the blueprint executing as designed under manipulated conditions. The proliferation is the primary accelerant. As missile defense systems like Turkey's Cypher-1 go online, they create a mathematical trap. They corner adversaries, removing all options for symmetric, kinetic retaliation. This dynamic forces a strategic pivot. A new way of warfare, as noted by security analysts, becomes the only logical path, one that prioritizes systemic shock over direct force. The objective shifts from defeating an army to triggering a solvency crisis in the shielded homeland. This new protocol requires a test, a calibration shot to measure response mechanisms without triggering a launch on warning order. The forecast: within the next 12 months, a Tier 1 logistical and data hub will experience a cascading, attribution-impossible failure. Expect a 48-hour blackout of a major trans-Pacific container port, simultaneous with the severing of its primary subsea data cable. It will be officially reported as a catastrophic infrastructure collapse. This is not the war. It is the collection of targeting data to calculate the kinetic cost of the next phase.